this, I want to finish off a little medley of various kinds of beetles you might see associated with vegetable crops. And let's start with the asparagus beetles. There are two very colorful beetles that are associated with this plant. One is called the asparagus beetle, one is called the spotted asparagus beetle, and they both have spots, but one is a little more discreet. And you can find the adults out and about on the plant, and both of them could be causing the kind of damage we see in the right, where you get the spears coming up in spring and they chew a little bit on it, and that can cause the spear to come out distorted and become non-marketable. But the asparagus beetle shown here, the spotted asparagus beetle shown here, is actually a fairly minor pest. You see it a lot, and the reason it's minor is this is pretty much the only kind of damage it might cause, because the rest of the time it's developing in the seeds. So this is a seed-feeding larva we see right here, and nobody really cares about the seeds of asparagus, and many crops don't even produce seeds. They're all male plants. So that's one distinct difference between the spotted asparagus beetle and the asparagus beetle. In the case of the asparagus beetle, you have the adults feeding on the developing spears as they come up in spring, but then they lay eggs on this plant. So getting that damage that I mentioned before with the spotted asparagus beetle, but then they're going to lay eggs on those plants, little black eggs. They might be on the spear that you're trying to market, and that would be a problem. And then they're laid on the ferns. The asparagus produces a very ferny plant if you're unfamiliar with it. And the eggs then hatch to produce larvae, and the larvae that feed on this are kind of a odd-looking thing. They're kind of slug-like, kind of greasy-looking. But they chew on the ferns, and if you get a lot of them, they might chew on the stem, the green material of the stem as well. So it kind of looks fairly skeleton-like in this case, if you have a heavy defoliation episode. So this is one that you can have 2 generations a year, and if they had high populations in all 2 generations, you could get extensive damage, and this would cause a reduction in yield the second year. So again, we're seeing two kinds of damage. Asparagus beetle causing direct injury just when the spears are coming up, because they might chew a bit on it, and they might lay some eggs on it. But then after that, you have the ferns, and then that's what is going to contribute to the next year crop. There are a lot of natural enemies of asparagus beetles: stink bugs, assassin bugs, damsel bugs, 3 kinds of predatory bugs. That pink-spotted lady beetle is again a predator of beetle larvae, and there is also a little tiny larval parasitoid of the asparagus beetle, and that's usually what does the trick. It is uncommon in most areas to have sustained high populations of this insect, because the parasite is usually so effective. But those would be things to look for. So this parasitoid, let me point out, is an egg larval parasitoid. So the wasp lays its eggs in the egg of the asparagus beetle, but then emerges from the larva of the asparagus beetle and kills it. Let's move on to an insect that is not actually have a formal common name from the ESA, but I call it the tomatillo leaf beetle. So that's why it's in parentheses here. And this is associated with Physalis species of plants. Physalis species, spelled out in the lower left, that's tomatillo, ground cherry, a couple other related plants. And this is a striped beetle, and it kind of looks like a cucumber beetle, striped cucumber beetle, or maybe a western corn rootworm, but it's got yellow and black and white. It's a pretty good-looking beetle, and it lays eggs on these kinds of plants: Physalis, tomatillo, ground cherry, etc. There's related species in this genus that lay it on datura and some other related plants, but this one's the only one that we see, I think, as an issue in vegetable crops. So the eggs laid looks fairly similar to lady beetle eggs. They're going to be just laid on these kinds of plants, though. And then you have larvae, and the larvae look quite similar to the larvae of the asparagus beetle that we just discussed, and they feed and may extensively defoliate the plants and reduce yield. They don't feed heavily on the fruit. They're mostly just feeding on the little husk that surrounds these kinds of fruit, which is a moderate market defect. The larvae are kind of interesting, though. Look at those in the upper left. And you can also see it in the one on the lower right. I've got a little arrow. They cover themselves with excrement. So particularly as they get closer to the time they're going to molt, they have more of this. So this is a kind of defense called a fecal shield. So they produce a fecal shield to protect themselves against predators. So not a particularly attractive looking insect, kind of slug-like to begin with, and then covers itself with feces. So this is something we're going to see in the next insect too. Tortoise beetles. So tortoise beetles have minor importance in vegetable crops, but you might see them on certain kinds of plants. But in particular, you'll see them on weeds in a garden. Many of these feed on weeds. Tortoise beetles get their name because most of them have a broad body form and kind of the body is flat, and so it kind of looks like it was covered as a tortoise shell would be. Somewhat look like lady beetles, I guess, but they're not. They're in this different subfamily. The one on the right is a little bit different looking. That's called the Argus tortoise beetle, and that doesn't have that flattening that is so typical of the others. What you're going to see with these insects is they produce holes on leaves. They're not really doing much, but they produce holes on leaves, and almost all of the tortoise beetles are found on morning glory family plants, Convolvulaceae, and that includes sweet potato, that includes morning glories, and that includes my favorite weed, not field bindweed, very common on field bindweed. Some are not feeding on morning glory plants. A pretty common species now in several areas of the country is the thistle tortoise beetle. This is one that was actually introduced, and it particularly likes to feed on Canada thistle. So there are a couple of things that are interesting about tortoise beetles, I think, and one is that some of them have a very high metallic shine, and this can be manipulated by the insect. So there are ones that might be brilliant gold, and sometimes people describe it as, I saw a golden lady beetle. No, if it's gold, it's a tortoise beetle. And some are not fully gold. Some might have some gold flecks. But anyway, a lot of them are really brightly colored. And this color is something they can manipulate. The way you get the high metallic color is if they hydrate the cuticle, it reflects in this way. But if they don't, if they're disturbed, they withdraw the water, and if they're dead, it's not hydrated. So this is an insect that if you pick it up and you see it on the plant and it's brilliantly gold, you get pretty excited, I guess. You kill it, you pin it, and it turns into a brown insect because it hasn't hydrated its cuticle. The other thing is this is another kind of insect that carries a fecal shield, and it does it a little differently. These have a fork at the very end of their body. The larvae, excuse me, we should talk about this. The larvae have a little fork at the end of their body, and the old skins, as they molt, get picked up there. They also have what's called a telescoping anus, and they can actually deposit their feces on top of this, and they kind of carry it over their body, kind of like a little parasol. And again, this has a defensive kind of purpose to protect them from predators. So very strange habits. Not a particularly important insect in the vegetable garden, but a very curious kind of insect. So tortoise beetles, again, are one group that you're likely to find perhaps more on some of the weeds you have than in the plants themselves, but one you should be aware of. And then finally, there is a family called the blister beetles, and these are beetles that often have an elongate body form and fairly soft wing covers. Now, most beetles have really hard wing covers. The first pair of wings, these are more leathery. So that elongated body and the forewings are being pretty soft compared to most beetles. These are various kinds of blister beetles. Some are striped, some are uniform colored, some are spotted. Most are elongate body. Typical form might be illustrated here. You have kind of a narrow neck area. That thorax is a little narrower than the head or the abdomen, and then again the soft leathery wings. In this case, this happens to have a little bit of striping. This is the margined blister beetle, a common species in the eastern U.S. There is one odd group of blister beetles known as the oil beetles in the genus Malo, and these are big, fat beetles. They have rudimentary wings. They can't fly, but they crawl, and you might see them on the ground. Um, Now, why are they called blister beetles? This is because they produce in their body, in their blood, a compound called cantharidin. And cantharidin is a highly toxic compound. It's a defensive compound. And in natural systems where they are defending themselves, their blood can be released in the form of what we call reflex bleeding, usually from the joints. So in the picture in the lower right, you can see a little droplet of the blood, and the blood contains this compound cantharidin. And some blister beetles have high levels of cantharidin in their blood, and some have fairly low levels. But it's a very toxic compound. And in high concentrations, cantharidin can cause blistering. In this case, this is a photo where somebody actually accidentally slapped a blister beetle that was on their back and got a pretty nasty looking set of blisters as a result. In this case, it wasn't painful, apparently, from the report associated with this picture from the University of Florida. But it can be irritating, and it's particularly irritating to parts of the skin that are a little more tender, so less so in the hands, but very highly irritating were it to get into the eyes. That could cause some serious problems. There is one thing that I just want to mention. It's related to blister beetles. If any of you are a horse person, you may know of this, but blister beetles sometimes can be a problem if they get into hay that is fed to horses. Blister beetles are toxic to many kinds of animals, but they're really toxic to horses, unfortunately. And there's one species that is quite common, kind of in the middle of the country, more Oklahoma, eastern Kansas, Nebraska, eastern Nebraska, called the striped blister beetle. And this is one that is hot for cantharidin. It has high levels of cantharidin. It also is attracted to alfalfa in bloom. And so you have an alfalfa field in bloom, you have these beetles in there, you come through, you cut the alfalfa, you crimp it and crush them in the hay as it dries. And then cantharidin is very stable. It would take, you can see in the table and below, it would only take the equivalent of 40 blister beetles to be fed to a 275-pound horse to kill it. Anyway, not a pleasant kind of thing to think about, but there is this issue with that in this other situation. Anyway, let's get back to blister beetles in general. Blister beetles have a kind of development that involves larval stages that look different in different times. It's called hypermetamorphosis. So they're going to have eggs and they're going to have larvae, but they're going to have first one kind of larvae, and the later other kinds of larvae. So the eggs hatch, and the first stage of a blister beetle is called a triungulin. And this has legs, and it actively moves around. And it's seeking out its host. So then we'll talk about what the various hosts are. But once it's found its host, it then molts and it becomes a sessile stage that looks kind of grub-like, and then it just consumes its host. So the legs become very reduced, and ultimately they transform to the pupal stage. So because of these radically different habits of the different larval instars, this is a term, hypermetamorphosis. You don't see it applied to very many insects. Blister beetles are the best example where this occurs. But let's talk about what they feed on as a larva. The majority of them, most all blister beetles you'll run into, feed on eggs of grasshoppers, and grasshoppers lay their eggs in pods. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And the triangulans seek out egg pods and can dig to them, and then if they find them, they start feeding and transform to that grub stage. So each blister beetle might consume 2-3 dozen eggs of a grasshopper. Um, so the kinds of blister beetles that feed on grasshopper eggs are illustrated here as examples. They're all in the genus Epicata, and there's scores of species in North America, but most of the problem species in terms of gardens are Epicata something. So the margin blister beetle, again, being a very common species in gardens in the eastern half of the United States. Black blister beetle is one that is very common as well, but it is found late in the season and just as a pollen feeder. Clematis blister beetle, if you grow clematis, it's a problem on that. Also other buttercup family plants, but that's getting into ornamentals. The oil beetles and the other genus, the other common genus, Lyta, that are iridescent, these ones develop on ground nesting bees. And here we, so the eggs are going to be laid in a kind of unique way that I can show you in a video at the end of this. And the larvae then find some way to get to the nest of a ground nesting bee, and then they consume the pollen, the nectar that was stored, and then also will feed and destroy the developing ground nesting bees, like a digger bee or a sweat bee or something like that. Adults of many blister beetles feed on foliage. Other blister beetles feed on pollen or flowers, but here we can see various blister beetles that do feed on leaves. And in general, they're not very important. You might see a few here or there, and they come and they go. They produce a compound called an aggregation pheromone, which is a signal, a chemical signal that causes them to come together in large groups. So blister beetles are a kind of insect that suddenly may appear en masse. You don't see any, and then all of a sudden you have 40, 50 all together, and then they may chew quite a bit. And they also may disappear quite suddenly too. But this is an aggregation behavior mediated by a pheromone. Then we talked about pheromones in the first class. Now, that's it for blister beetles, but I have an optional material if you want to stay in and watch. This is a video. I think it's really interesting on one of these oil beetles and how their larvae find their way to a ground nesting bee. So this isn't going to be on the quiz. This is just FYI. This is going to run another 5 minutes or so, but if you want to watch this, here it is.
Start in life can take a lot of effort, so some insects have evolved highly complex to become nursemaids on their behalf. This Californian desert hardly seems to be the best place to find nursemaids, but blister beetles have an amazing way of discovering them. It starts simply enough with the female beetle. She has dug a hole and is now laying her eggs in it. That done, she abandons them. A few centimeters below the surface of the sand, conditions are good for eggs. Not too cold, neither too hot, even in the heat of the day. 6 weeks later, they hatch. But these sands are very barren and scorching hot. Somehow the tiny larvae have got to find food, and they won't find it here. Their survival depends on teamwork. Together, as a closely coordinated group, they climb up a stem of withered grass. Get to the top, there's nowhere else to go. They look dangerously exposed to the sun and to other predators, but there they stay in a tight, squirming mass. For those that can get there, the top of this stem has become a stage for a remarkable piece of deception. What these larvae want is a lift, a ride, and they want it so badly that sometimes they'll even try and get it from a human finger. But what they're really searching for is not a human finger. They're searching for another insect. Here it comes, a female digger bee, leaving a tunnel that she's just dug for her own young. She's off to gather pollen. She packs it into baskets on her back legs and takes it back to her burrow. It'll provide valuable food for her young when they eventually hatch. And here comes a male. He's on the lookout for a female. To him, the cluster not only looks like a female, it smells like a female, for the beetle larvae are producing a perfume, a pheromone, that is exactly like that emitted by a female bee. He alights in order to mate, and in seconds is covered by the larvae that swarm all over him. At first, he seems stunned by the shock of his sudden increasing weight. But then he's off again. Now his luck improves. This really is a female. And while he mates, his passengers jump ship. Now they're all on board a female bee. She, having mated, goes back to her nest to lay, taking the larvae with her. At last, the young beetle larvae have reached safety, and food, the stored of pollen that the female digger bee worked so hard to collect for her own young. So they hop off and tuck in. Not only do they consume the